Let's do some calculations concerning sales mix. So I've given us some data here. We've got two different items. We're just going to call those a generic item A and item B. So we've got the per unit sales price and the per unit variable cost for each item. We've also been told the total units sold for each. And we're assuming that these are the only two items for our company. So this makes up the entire sales mix for our company. We also know that the company's fixed costs are $570,000. So the first thing I want to figure out is, what is my sales mix percentage? Because that's going to help me determine some other items down the road. So to do that, with the data that I've been given, we can simply look at the total units sold for each of these in relation to overall units. So we know that we have 2,450 units of item A that were sold, and we have 1,050 units of item B. So our total units are just the sum of those, which is 3,500 units. Again, I just took the 2,450 and added the 1,050 to see how much we had sold in total. So that means for item A, we have 2,450 units out of a total of 3,500 units. So as a percentage, product A accounts for 70%. We can do the same thing for product B. That was 1,050 units out of 3,500 units. And that gives me 30%. And you should see that these two would equal 100% if these are our only two products in a sales mix. And they do. So that tells me our actual sales mix percentage between the two products. Now, knowing that, I can go forward and do several different calculations. All of those that we did previously, like contribution margin, break-even analysis, margin of safety, we can work through all those types of problems using a sales mix. So first thing we want to look at is, let's do our contribution margin. So to do that, again, contribution margin is just sales minus variable cost. Well, if we go back up, erase that. If we go back up, we see that our per unit sales price and our per unit variable cost, we know those already. So for item A, we have a contribution margin equal to $300. $500 minus the $200, that's $300 again per unit. For item B, our contribution margin would equal $250 because we have a sale price of $600 and variable cost of $350. So those are our contribution margin per unit for each item. But if we're talking about contribution margin company-wide, then we need to take into account the sales mix, because we don't sell these equally. They don't make up for equal portions of our sales. So that's where our sales mix percentage is going to come in. We need to convert this contribution margin per unit to what we refer to as a weighted average contribution margin per unit. You can't just take the 300 and the 250 and add them together. That's not going to work. You have to do them based on their percentages. So for A, we had 70%, and for B, we had 30%. So we're going to multiply those percentages by their related contribution margins per unit. Then we can see the overall contribution margin for the entire company. So to do that, again, we're just going to take, for A, that $300 contribution margin per unit and multiply it by our sales mix percentage, which was 70%. So that gives me a weighted average contribution margin per unit of $210. For item B, we had a contribution margin of $250 and a sales mix percentage of 30%. So that gives me a weighted average, a weighted average contribution margin per unit of $75. Now I can add the two together because they are weighted correctly now. So in total, my contribution overall for the company is $285 per unit. weighted average contribution margin. Now I can use this the same that we used all those other figures when we did our analysis before with contribution margin. But again, be very careful. You cannot use just that 300 and that 250 together because they're not weighted correctly. They don't make up the same percentage of the sales mix. It's almost like you have two components of one overall product, as if A and B were making, say, a C, and it's just the pieces that fit into it. So we have to do that weighted average calculation before we go further with any type of other numbers or data that we'd want to use using things like contribution margin figures. Now, what we can use this for is to determine things like break even. Okay, so now that we've got the contribution margin, we can go forward from there. Before we do break even, though, I want to show you one other way to get your your sales mix percentage. Let's say instead of knowing units sold, you knew total sales dollars. So let's say you had total sales equal to $800,000. And you had, give you some different data, let's say you had product X and product Y. X had sales of $640,000. Y had sales of $160,000. You can use total sales dollars to also determine your sales mix percentage. So, for instance, X, it's $640,000 of the overall $80,000. So X's sales mix percentage would come to 80%. Y is $160,000 of the $800,000, and that comes to 20%. And again, this equals 100% because these are the only two components of our sales mix. So that should make sense. Okay. Now, going back to our previous data, let's kind of refresh our memories on what we've done here. So here's the data that we had. We got our contribution margin, weighted contribution margin per unit. We know our sales mix percentage, and we had this data here that was given to us to begin with. So let's do some break-even analysis on this. Let's do break-even in units first. Okay, to refresh, break-even in units, we have to look at fixed costs and divide that by normally our unit contribution margin. This is your general break-even in units. Now for us, because we have a sales mix, that unit contribution needs to be the weighted average unit contribution margin. All right, so let's go back and look at our numbers. Fixed costs we see are $570,000. And when we did our weighted contribution margin, that came to $285. So now we just need to do the division on that. We had $570,000 in fixed costs. We're going to divide that by that weighted unit contribution margin. And that's going to give me 2,000. That tells me the number of units that I need to sell to break even. You could also do this for break even in dollars. Another way to do this. So now let's look at break even in dollars. Okay, again, to refresh, that is your fixed costs. But now we're going to divide by your contribution margin ratio. And again, with a sales mix, you need a weighted contribution margin ratio. Okay, so different than what we saw before. Since we already had some total sales dollars on this second example that I gave you, let's use this data for the break-even in dollars. So we know our total sales are $800,000. X accounts for $640,000 of that, and Y accounts for $160,000 of that. Let's come in and also put variable costs. So this is sales data here. Let's do variable cost data right beside it. So let's say we had $288,000 in variable costs for X. We had $120,000 in variable costs for Y. Okay. Based on that, we can get a contribution margin ratio. That's just your contribution margin divided by sales. So we take the difference between the 640 and the 280, and then we're going to divide that by the 640 again. That's going to give me a contribution margin ratio of 55%. And if we do the same for Y, the 160 minus the 120, you get 40,000, and you're going to divide that by 160, your sales. That's going to give you 25% for contribution margin ratio there. Okay. Again, we can't use those figures individually. What we need to do is get a weighted average as an overall total. So, what I need to do is take that for X, that 0.55, and for Y, take the 0.25 and multiply it by their sales mix percentage. X was 80%, Y was 20%. So we'll take the 80% or 0.80, however you want to write this, and the 20%. That means that as a weighted average, I have 0.44, for X and 0.05 for Y. Overall, that comes to 0.49 as a weighted contribution margin ratio. Now I can plug this into my formula. Let's assume that fixed costs in this case were $352,800. We're going to divide that by our weighted contribution margin ratio of 0.49. This tells me that our break even in dollars is going to come to $720,000.